There are growing concerns about violence and intimidation, particularly on or after Election Day. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project says that there is a risk. The nonprofit organization, which tracks political violence and protests around the world, put out this report detailing the most active right-wing militias in America. For more, I want to bring in Charles Marino. He is a former Department of Homeland Security advisor. Charles is also the CEO of Sentinel Security Solutions. Charles, great to have you with us. This report identifies 3 types of right-wing militia groups in the U.S. Can you break those down for us?
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for having me. What we're seeing here is we're seeing this report, 55 pages in length, surmise that militia groups, right-wing militia groups, do pose a serious threat to the American public, and specifically as we lead to a run-up in the election, a specific threat to American voters, both prior to, during, and after, depending on the results of those elections. The group followed 80 militia groups and tracked their recent activity. And what we're seeing is we're seeing these 3 subgroups start to become more assertive, more politically aligned in terms of their activities. We can point out the recent activities in Michigan against Governor Whitman, where we had the Wolverine Watchmen plot to not only kidnap but possibly kill the governor. It's these types of activities and these groups that we're looking at, the 3%ers, the Oath Keepers, and a vast majority of other nationwide groups that are increasing the threat to the country. Further, we recently saw the Department of Homeland Security and FBI issue their joint intelligence bulletin, which indicated that these groups, more specifically aligned with white supremacy, pose the #1 threat domestically to the country.
Yeah, I think that those planned attacks against Governor Whitmer and her family certainly brought that into sharp focus for a lot of us here in the country. Tell us, what do those groups really have in common? And in particular, why focus on just right-wing groups?
Well, what we're seeing here is you put up the list of those locations that are at high risk: Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Oregon, and then a subset of moderate risk locations. And the way that's done, the way the report is based, is basically what is the freedom in which these groups are able to operate, be it from recruitment events, be it what are deemed friendly relationships with law enforcement, and just an overall freedom to operate without interruption. Some of these groups like to operate more discreetly, but that we are seeing more outward activities aligned with a certain political party, and that is unfortunately the Republican Party. The other thing, too, that we have here that's troublesome is we're not seeing an overt, ramification in terms of how bad these groups actually are from the Republican Party, and in this case in point, the president. That is giving a certain level of enticement to these groups, a perception of acceptability and support, and it's causing bigger problems for the law enforcement agencies across the country.
Well, of the states listed as high risk in this report, all but 1 are swing states. I'm wondering, does that particularly concern you?
It is. There's a tie. It's a great question. There is a tie to the fact that some of these states are swing states. There's also another commonality that many of these states had what would be determined to be stricter coronavirus restrictions to kind of knock down the numbers of the pandemic in their communities. And these right-wing militia groups, again, in their anti-government thinking and thinking along the lines of more freedoms, are against these particular locations. They feel that their freedoms have been restricted and in some cases taken away in these locations, and that's what they are against. So here we have a big problem because, one, we know that these groups are much more organized than some of those leftist groups like Antifa and alike, and also they are historically armed. So we're not only looking, like your previous guest said, about the concerns of voter intimidation, but we're also looking about the capability to carry out targeted, organized, armed activities in these areas if they don't like what's going on, to include not liking potentially the outcome of the election.
So these groups, as you say, are more organized, they're historically armed, and now there is at least the perception of support, as you say, from the president. So at the fundamental level of the question that we have for this segment, are we really concerned? Should we be concerned about the potential for violence if these groups don't find that the person that they wanted to be in the White House, if that person isn't elected?
We certainly need to be prepared. I've spoken to many law enforcement officials across the major cities across the country, and those plans are in fact being put in place as we speak in the event that we have these activities following the election results. I think we need to be prepared. I think there is some level of concern on both sides, but more on the right-wing side, that if the election does not turn out the way they like, that there could be some violent activities that take place across the country. And law enforcement is going to be prepared for these such events. But, you know, what we really need here is we need the political leaders, especially on the Republican side, to come out and denounce these activities, denounce these groups, come out and do so strongly. There should be no perception out there that there is some passive support for these activities. They can't be looked at as voters. They need to be looked at as the potential disruptors, not only negatively impacting voter turnout, but also potential violent activities following the elections. And these elected officials need to do so firmly, both at the local and national levels, and let these groups know that there's no place and no desire for their activities or involvement during the electoral process.
So law enforcement and federal agencies actually used to be more focused on right-wing militias. I was actually just speaking with somebody about this the other day. The focus on these groups was intense following the Oklahoma City bombing. But then after 9/11, there really was a movement more towards foreign terrorism. Have you seen that there's actually been this increase, that these right-wing militias have been allowed to grow because there simply isn't the resources or a political will behind stopping them anymore?
Yeah, you bring up Oklahoma City and September 11th, and while it may have shifted slightly towards foreign terrorism with the Bureau, now that the Bureau has a solely terrorism statutory authority here in focus in terms of preventing attacks against the country, you are seeing both ample attention being paid not only to foreign organizations, but also here domestically. I think you saw great coordination with the Michigan State Police in the example we were talking about earlier with Governor Whitmer. So the FBI is in tune to these domestic groups. I think this report highlights just how vast the problem is, how disparate the organizations are across the country, and their nationwide impact and organizational capabilities here. So they will stay on the radar, both as they are now prior to the election, during and following. And the FBI, working with local authorities and the Joint Terrorism Task Force, will work to disrupt any planning or violent activities associated with the election.
Well, we are certainly grateful for that. One last question before I let you go. The study focuses on groups, but it obviously only takes one person to start violence. From a national security standpoint, how concerned are you about groups versus individuals, and which one is really harder to prevent?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing here is based on the activities of the Wolverine Watchmen in Michigan. There's now been an elevation in terms of attention that are given to some of these right-wing militia groups. And my summation is that many of those groups kind of do not want that type of attention. But the fact is, it is where it is right now, and they are getting the attention and the scrutiny. So as a result, they're going to be much easier to detect. They're larger organizations, they're nationwide, so they have to cross state lines. So in those situations, they are going to be easier to detect and disrupt by federal and state, local law enforcement. What you're speaking to, individual actors, lone wolves, are certainly the biggest challenge here, right? Those are individuals that are going to act independently may have a very loose association with some of these groups or another group, and therefore have a higher rate to be undetected. So certainly the FBI and the rest of the law enforcement and intelligence communities do pay a high level of attention to what we call lone wolf actors. But I think here you'll see an equal amount of attention in the entire apparatus and all the different types of ways that these groups may seek to act out.
All right, a sobering assessment of a rising threat. All right, Charles Marino, thank you.